FAIR principles and the who, what, when, where, why, and how framework are useful approaches for thinking about the effectiveness and thoroughness of metadata content. But we still lack a perspective that is useful for answering the key questions about how we should organize the metadata for our data product. One of the reasons this question is difficult to answer definitively is that the answer always starts with "it depends." A detailed organization of the metadata needed for a given data product always depends on the use cases for the data. Diversity in use cases inherently results in diversity in the metadata organization that is useful across those use cases. But that doesn't stop us from trying to define abstractions that provide general guidelines or categories for organizing metadata. Library scientists have been working for millennia to understand the general strategies for allowing people to effectively find elements of curated collections that are useful for their efforts. In the information age, that effort has extended from physical items to entities composed of digital information, which has relatively recently wildly increased the diversity in use cases and the rate of development of new use cases for that information. DublinCore is an ISO standard for the general organizational categories of metadata that have been suggested by the library science community to address these challenges. It is purposefully abstract and simple, composed fundamentally of just 15 elements. The goal of these abstractions is to recognize the need for flexibility to address the multitudes of use cases for digital data entities, such that the specific implementation of these 15 elements can take many different forms as appropriate for a given use case. Dublin Core by itself cannot be implemented directly because it only defines the general rules for defining a metadata organization scheme, not a scheme on its own. We're not going to dive into the details of the Dublin Core definition, but it is important to note that many metadata standards in library science as a whole are built on top of this abstraction. And it was defined and refined by the professionals who make a living out of trying to understand the best ways to work with curatorial metadata. The Ecological Metadata Language, or EML, is an example of an implementation of the Dublin Core standard that provides a specific strategy for organizing environmental metadata. The EML file format is based on the Extensible Markup Language Standard, or XML. And the idea of XML is to define data structures called tags that effectively allow a flat file of raw text to represent a hierarchical organization of information within that file. XML is the basis for many other standards for the organization of digital information, including HTML used for formatting web pages, and Microsoft DocX, XLSX, and PPTX files, to name just a few. We'll talk about EML in more detail in our case study later, but let's get back to the more general question. If the structure of metadata depends on the use case, then how do you ultimately decide how to organize metadata for your particular data product? In my experience, an effective practice is to work backward from the metadata that is required by the repository that will be curating your data product. That repository will likely have some sort of metadata file you need to submit, or some sort of metadata online form you will need to fill out before they will accept your contribution. While this will get you started, it might not be a good idea to think that this is where your effort should end. Repositories have variable priorities and various levels of specificity with which they think about the use cases for reuse of the data they curate. Therefore, some repositories' minimum requirements for metadata may be insufficient for the community you would like to be able to meaningfully use your data. In these cases, you'll need to let your personal ethics and experience define the additional metadata you include for that community. I want to emphasize again here that when I use the term community, I'm referring to the group of people that includes your future self. Even if nobody else ever uses your data, you're doing yourself a favor by making sure it's easy to tweak and redo your analysis with a few keystrokes or clicks of the mouse. In the end, many of the metadata requirements across repositories ask for the same basic elements. But repositories have a wide variety of requirements and how those elements need to be submitted. We will review a basic outline for metadata organization that should allow you to readily provide those elements when submitting a data product to any repository. This outline is sufficiently detailed to allow you to provide metadata for the repositories with more robust curation strategies like EDI, or this detailed outline will also allow you to provide complete and unambiguous metadata to users of your data product, even if you are sharing data without a repository or you are using a repository without robust metadata requirements.